She's Professor of Social and Political Histories of Art and Director of Centre CAF at the University of Leeds, and she has been writing about Lubaina's art and other black women's art for decades, and has decades of experience of writing about this art, lots of it in very, very incisive and interesting ways. Today she's talking about Haunted by Voices and Challenged by Representations, post-colonial feminist pedagogies between art and literature. Thank you. Hello? Yeah.
I want to join with everybody else who's here and who's come and who's spoken and who's participated in the collective world that we've created for these two days to say I'm very, very honoured to be part of this. I am learning as much as I ever learned from listening, and now I'm very privileged to have a chance to speak with you, and I look forward to your responses. Thank you to the organisers. I feel we owe everybody a huge debt of making this collective coming together possible. Okay, in 1992, I established a dedicated and indeed unique graduate program in feminism and visual arts at the University of Leeds, known for short as Mayfair, which sounded a bit like a sanitary program. For a period around 2000, Lubaina Himid was a scrupulous and rigorous external examiner for those on that degree who opted for the practice route. You could take an academic, a practice, a curatorial route through it. Lubaina had first come to Leeds in 1984 at the invitation of Shutler's Biswas, who was a student in fine art. She came with Sonia Boyce and first planted the roots and their presence as black women artists in a fine art degree which has not yet really noticed the original nature of this gesture, but anyway, she was there and she came back regularly and has been supportive to so many of us and so many of our projects, risking the journey from Preston to Leeds on the variable trains over and over again to lend her beautiful voice and her brilliant mind and her powerful creativity to foster what we have been trying to do. On this degree, there was only one young man in the entire history, a brave queer young man who came, and he did the practice one, and he set up his show for Lubaina to come and interview, investigate and examine. He installed a vast cinemascope scale billboard in the Parkinson Court of the University of Leeds, which you see in its echoing classical, terrifying form in that image, on which he projected an image of unfortunately a woman who had passed away, who'd been killed in the atrocities of the Balkans. The image was cropped but hugely and sensitively expanded in a gesture of mourning for such atrocities. Streaming from the cinematic image was a white silken flow of cloth. Between the animation that we associate with classical drapery and the invocation of a shroud, the cloth was the abstract material matter of the piece, flowing into the public space the installation occupied and interrupted. Lubaina Himid studied the work with her quiet and deeply probing gaze. Her question to the... I'm not wanting to laugh, she has a deep and probing gaze. Her question to the artist was this: how many pieces of cloth did you try out before you found this one? Jonathan looked perplexed. Well, I went to the market and I looked for white cloth, he confessed. Lubaina Himid replied, something like this: if it were my work, I would have bought and experimented with every kind of whiteness and every kind of cloth until I knew that its fall, its colour, its weight, its lightness, its flow would enable me to know what I was wanting to say. I know the story by heart. I tell it over and over again to my own fine art students, both to encourage them to learn that art happens only in that condition of profound respect and a condition of profound unknowing, and to encourage them to think materially. In Lubaina Himid's question to this one hapless artist, however, lay the ethics and politics that we might want to name, but not to label, in order to be able to grasp its significance as black women's creativity. If I were to link it with what we collectively have come here together to encounter and explore, Black women's creativity, I know it has only made the following paper necessary for me to arrive at a provisional understanding of what that is. For me, the path is not through choosing which precise fabric one can ensure the aesthetic effect of encounter this and that artist seeks to create, but in choosing whose voices to allow to haunt my imagination, to disturb my peace, to drive my words, and undo that against which Black women's creativity crashes in the blinding whiteness, not of cloth of a shroud, but of an entire social and imaginative world, which, in my whiteness, I do not see. Now, the various pathways on this Mayfem presented students with what I am regularly told in the cast of discussing them as they come back to me after years and years, was a terrifying encounter in their first module with feminism and culture theoretical perspectives, to which they responded. So I thought I would be very theoretical and propose to them a much easier way, in which actually turned out to be much more difficult, is that they should read 3 novels. They should read Landscape for a Good Woman by Carolyn Stegman, Toni Morrison's Beloved, and Mary Cardinal's Words to Say It. Each novel invited the reader to encounter the complexity, historically, culturally, politically, psychologically, and socially, of a world in which women are gendered, sexed, raced, sexual, classed, and since the 16th century have become victims and products of colonialism and of genocide. Sedman's text is a double autobiography of 2 working-class British women straddling the north and the south, pre-war Rochdale, post-war London, in Britain informed by Free University and a feminist social history that took Carolyn, the child of many women who worked in service in the 19th century, into being a professor at Warwick University. Mary Cardinal's autobiography traces her psychotic breakdown, psychoanalysis and recovery, and she is an Algerian-born colonial French woman carrying her mother's trauma and hatred in her own endlessly bleeding womb. Toni Morrison's novel needs no introduction, but it is a fictive rethinking of a historical figure, Margaret Garner, whose murder of her children, rather than allow them to be re-enslaved, led to the infamous trial in which Margaret Garner was accused of the destruction of property rather than of murder or infanticide. In 2005, this story of the claim for maternal subjecthood through the claim to her own children became the foundation for an opera, premiered in Detroit with a libretto by Toni Morrison and a score composed by a Persian Jewish composer, Richard Daniel Poor, with Denise Graves in the original role, but I'm going to show you the video about this collaboration now. Okay, we're going to escape.
I was editing a book at Random House, and it was a kind of scrapbook of there's all sorts of things that emanated from African American culture. And I came across this woman, Margaret Garner, and the story was that a slave woman had killed her children or tried to kill them all. What struck me was the theme was that she was not crazy. And they were stunned to find her A, articulate, B, sane, and 3, interested in doing it again. And she was not apologetic. She didn't say, oh my God, what have I done? She was as steady as a rock, and I thought that was extraordinary.
I think the greatest challenge in writing the character of Margaret was musically portraying a sense of transformation. You have a woman in Margaret Garner who is born a slave, but she finds her own freedom from within. You have that lilting gait of a lullaby going throughout it. It was a kind of innocent quality, not only because of the child, but because of the mother.
I've been involved in the process of preparing Margaret Garner since 2003.
That that's very, very different, for instance, from what you see after she has gone through this horrible act.
I first heard the opera through the composer himself, Richard Daniel Poor. He played for me the opera and sang the parts. It had a wonderful, vibrant, and rich black sound to it. It captured the dark timbre of the piece in terms of Margaret's soul.
It's unbelievable to sing Toni Morrison's words.
The people's speech, I don't care if they're Hungarians or Spanish or what, it has what they need, which is a little bit, it's succinct, it's metaphorical, it's rhythmic, it's funny, and it gets sort of at the heart of things, you know. And I like to pull that quality from spoken speech. It's just the metaphor that you use. And when she sings quality love, I mean, quality, that's all the whole system was about. Who's a quality person, you know, class. And so she just changes it and talks about it, you know, as an emotion that is elegant and moral and legal and hers.
Margaret questions the meaning of love and decides that there's only one kind of love. She understands this love to be the love that she shares between her and her husband, Robert.
Her love is so strong that it comforts her in the midst of all of this violence.
I'll leave you just to listen to that on YouTube and enjoy the wonderfulness of that voice. There, and this is for the Bena who loves the voice, the sound of women's voices. Now, the majority of students on the course obviously found each of these novels completely familiar and alien in different degrees. Class, as we know, fishes everything. The experience of growing up in a colonial country is particular to some, but for white European and non-white European readers, Beloved was typically the hardest of the three to read. Psychoanalysis can be alien, class is so hopelessly British, but the terms of the crime against humanity that Morrison's novel explores from the position of an African-American writer, writing both for African-American readers and for non-African-American readers to read, positions non-black people as white, whether or not they are directly descended from slave traders or slavers or slaveholders. The crime was the crime of Europe, however, of pre- and post-Renaissance Christian Europe, sustained by many Enlightenment philosophers that we still are asked to read and study and admire. The novel situates those who are not of African descent in a relation to and as perpetrators of the crimes of enslavement and its colonial extension on which modern Europe and its subjectivities have been built. This indicts a world that this crime whitened, this indicts a world that by this crime was whitened. If you take the counterexample, in the case of the Holocaust, for instance, anybody who did not sign up to the National Socialist Party membership, non-German or German alike, can distance themselves from those ghastly fascists. Okay? But as a white person, we who constructed the crime we name race allows no such hiding place, and especially not for the liberals. So following the complex logic within feminism which posits the term women, in order to have it immediately confront its internal fault lines, to name the agonistic zones of conflict, and engender a politics of transformation through a truly dark knowledge. Listening, reading, thinking with the texts of black women's writing and the art of black women is a work some of us undertake not to learn ourselves through identification, but to unlearn ourselves through what the Israeli thinker Bracha Ettinger has named self-fragilization, and the ethical position of the impossibility of not sharing the degradation of any other human being's humanity. The impossibility of not sharing the degradation of any other human being's humanity and still remaining human. So, the purpose of that argument is to suggest that whiteness is associated with the process of inhumanness. It claims for itself to be the source of humanity and humanism, but it actually is indicted in a certain way. So let me explain this by going from these novels to another text by Toni Morrison. Playing in the Dark. So at the time of starting this feminist pedagogic intervention, I listened on audio tapes to hypnotic voice and read the pellucid prose to marvel at the literary genius of Toni Morrison, reading her own novels. I also studied this book, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination, which is a series of lectures given published in 1992. It's definitely an American book, in which the author seeks to dispossess that term American, just as feminism unmasked the masculinism within the word human, to dispossess the term American of its proprietorial whiteness. Her purpose was to expose the paradox of the United States as a country and America as an idea. The hyphenated addition of African to American to produce a certain identity precisely denies a history in which people of African descent and other black folks were already there on the continent, some for several thousands of years, and others we know are recorded from the 12th, 13th, and 14th century. When the Europeans arrived, they met various Africans on the Latin American continent, because they had been what? Merchants, traders, Atlantic sailors, long before the Europeans got the bad idea. As the men and women, these new Europeans arrived in the New World to be free from the limitations and oppressions of old Europe, Toni Morrison argues that they forged a literature to represent their newness that relied on the invention of a negative to their positive. She's arguing that they needed the unfree, and they placed the African Americans amongst them in both real and symbolic ways in an extremity of this counter condition, this condition of dehumanization. Thus Morrison effectively turns the tables and reads so-called American literature for the manner in which the construction of Americanness as whiteness and whiteness as American could only happen through art, in a sense, through the fictional structuring, not just the stories and content, but the fictional structuring of literature, the American literature, by this invented blackness. That blackness she names white America's necessary and invented Africanism. Let me quote from her. I can't read with her voice, I wish I could. These speculations have led me to wonder whether the major and champion characteristics of our national literature, individualism, masculinity, social engagement versus historical isolation, acute and ambiguous moral problematics, the thematics of innocence coupled with an obsession with figurations of death and hell. I wonder if these are not in fact responses to a dark, abiding, signing Africanist presence. It has occurred to me that the very manner in which American literature distinguishes itself as a coherent unity exists because of this unsettled and unsettling population. Just as the formation of the nation necessitated coded language and purposeful restriction to deal with the racial disingenuousness, everybody's free except, and moral frailty at its heart, so too did the literature whose founding characteristics extend into the 20th century reproduce the necessity for codes and restriction. Through the significant and underscored omissions, startling contradictions, heavenly nuanced conflict, to the way writers people their work with the signs and bodies of this presence, one can see that a real or fabricated Africanist present was crucial to their sense of Americanness, and it shows. And she defines Africanism as a way, not a description of people, but as a way on the part of those who invent it, of contemplating the dialectics of chaos and civilization, desire and fear, and a mechanism for testing the problems of the blessings of freedom. This is a very challenging and rather remarkable argument, which I may be, and since mangling as I struggle with it, and I do encourage you to read it, because as I understand it, Toni Morrison reads American literature from the point of view of a novelist. She's drawing our attention precisely in the terms that Lubena has insisted we think. How do things work? How do they work? How do they do it? Not just materially, but through structures, through compositions, through procedures. So how do they form what she names the invisible goldfish bowl that holds the content that we as readers glean? So we talk about characters, events, and themes, but then she says, It was as if I had been looking into a fishbowl. The gliding flick of the golden scales, the green tip, the bolt of white careening back and from the gills, the castles at the bottom, the surrounded by pebbles and tiny intricate green fronds, the barely disturbed water, the flecks of waste in the food, the tranquil bubbles, etc. And suddenly I saw the ball, the structure that transparently and invisibly permits the ordered life it contains to exist in the larger world. In other words, I began to rely on my knowledge of how books get written, how language arrives, my sense of how and why writers abandoned or take on certain aspects of their project. I began to rely on my understanding of what the linguistic struggle requires of writers, and what they make of the surprise that in the inevitable concomitant act of creation. What becomes transparent is the self-evident ways that Americans choose to talk about themselves through and within a sometimes allegorical, sometimes metaphorical, but always choked representation of an African presence. Now, she concludes that the so-called American novel produces its recurring tropes that form this image of Americanness: freedom, self-definition, possibility, escape, precisely through constantly, structurally, linguistically iterating and fashioning the condition of and constituting unfree other. Why is, in a sense, the creation, now this is not to say that African peoples were not enslaved, this is the historical reality, but what she wants to show us is how the imaginative continuation of that historical reality long after the abolition becomes constitutive of what is America, and it is against that, this fictive form of the perpetuation of an unfree to represent the condition of freeness that sort of, as it were, bedevils any of our attempts to imagine transformation and political progress. What Africanism became for and how it functioned in the literary imagination is of paramount interest because it may be possible to discover through a look at literary blackness, the nature, even the cause of literary whiteness. What is it for? What part did the invention and development of whiteness play in the construction of what is loosely described as American? If such an inquiry ever comes to maturity, it may provide access to a deeper reading of American literature, reading not completely available now, and not least, I suspect, because of the studied indifference of most literary criticism to these matters. So, there's more to be said, and I encourage you to read it, but time will be not on my side. If we go back for a moment, however, to Beloved, what we discover in Beloved is not simply that it is a story about Sethi and her children and baby sons and all the men of Sweet Home, etc. It is precisely to create a novel in which the subjective dramatic center of the novel are these characters, but they are characters who are haunted and menaced. Their worlds are darkened by other creatures whom Morrison creates because their actions afflict her subjects. They are the persecutors in the form of the teacher and the henchman. So in literary terms, they introduce whiteness as a structural force, like a cloud in the sky that perpetually blocks out the sun, and constantly seeks to deprive their subjects of the security in the possibility of remaining subjects. But what these people are not just white folks, they are a race representation of the inhuman. And that, I think, is what the novel tries to put before us. Now, some of you will know, and I'm wearing my very strange identification, that I was born in Africa. So there are several of us who have this in different ways and with different rights to name that. But I opened my infant eyes on the places and colors of Africa, which, as Lubena was mentioning last night, somehow haunt our most primary aesthetic memories in terms of those experiences we have when we return. Now, I was born in 1949. That means 1 year after apartheid was established officially in South Africa. What am I doing? My time, I'm just running out of time. Okay. And I think I'll just jump to the over this bit, etc. But that the question of thinking through, I'm not American, I'm not British, what it is that I carry of this is obviously this is one of the most extreme 20th century crimes, but it was built absolutely in continuous with British imperialism and Dutch imperialism right back to the 16th, 17th century when all the way through from Reekirk through to Cecil Rhodes. I was going to introduce this, but I worked with the great and wonderful South African photographer Santu Mofokeng, whose work called Landscapes of Trauma intrigued me because of his going to the landscapes of Europe's trauma and visiting the sites of Auschwitz. And I've written at length about this, but I wanted to introduce this quite extraordinary image of this as a photographic work in which he stands looking out of a window with a reflection of the building opposite, the interior of the building in which he is projected onto the building opposite of Auschwitz Stammlager 1, in which he himself taking the photograph becomes, as it were, a stain in the picture. And I wondered at length about his journey around Europe from a recently liberated South Africa in terms of Germany creating in Europe, and indeed the Nationalist Party in South Africa creating what I call a concentrationary society, a society of systematic perversion and unfreedom. I worked with this photograph for many years because it means a great deal to me. It is a kind of landscape of trauma of my hand. It is myself on the beach with my mother. It is one of the few images I have of my mother looking at me. So it was invested when my mother died when I was very young with enormous power. But of course, my problem was, I'm just going to go leave those, is I wasn't looking to this part of the image. Many years later, as I began to work on this and think about myself, I turned to this central figure, the one who has the gaze, the one who's looking at the husband, photographing the cute scene of his daughter and mother and his wife on the beach. She who has no arms around the child she probably had, who is probably thousands of miles away, but is offering her warmth and her body to be the chair on which a young man abandoned probably by his white mother, who's playing golf, playing bridge, having an affair, doing all the things that having other people in servitude makes possible. So this different, sort of these two sides of this image of our own investment in our memories of certain places, of this beach, which I even asked Leandra to go and photograph when she was on holiday the other day in South Africa, and this double image of this, and I've done a series of paintings of this relationship for several years trying to explore this space. But I want to end by this space coming back to the fact that Lubena Himid was also born, taken for 4 months old when she was taken from the coast of Zanzibar to negotiate the class and race societies of post-war Britain. Lubena Himid tells us she also has a coastal memory of Zanzibar, which emerged in her Zanzibar paintings with this scintillating evocation of the coast of the Indian Ocean, painted in 1999. She also has worked again on the beaches in her wonderful series Beach Houses, where this space of very fragile temporary homes on these wonderfully coloured edges of the world, the vision of the transport, the vision of East Africa as the great site of incredible connections with the the Indian subcontinent, with Asia, the trade, the exchanges, the cultural forms, the linguistic forms of Eastern Africa are there to be claimed, but some of these beach houses are in fact around all the places that she now has visited. So I want to use the theme of the beach, the coast, the edge, the ocean, to leap finally to the writings of one South African woman who published under the name of Ellen Kuzweyo and simply decried calling woman. And I want to show you one element of this extraordinary woman, an author, a politician. She became one of the first black representatives in Parliament. She comes from a very, very interesting history of the middle class, the land-owning, property-owning classes in South Africa, which again Santu Mofokeng reminds us of in his black photo album of a very different vision of South African black South African families. And then I want to show you this little scene on a beach, if I have a moment.
Tanzania. In the early 1980s, we made a film called Mama I'm Crying, telling the story of apartheid. In those years of oppression, South Africa was filled with fear and despair. And yet we witnessed the amazing courage of the people. Now that a veil has been lifted off the heart of a nation, I am returning to this land of my birth, to revisit the people we filmed during those years, and to discover how they feel in the new South Africa.
South Africa, we love you. Our beautiful land. Let's show them all around. We can bring peace in our land.
Through this journey, in those fearful years, they were both in prison for their stand against apartheid. We were so excited this year when Ellen, at the age of 80, became a Member of Parliament after a lifetime of being denied the vote.
So it's Ellen Kuzwe and Joyce Soroke.
Many things go through one's mind. And you say, is it true? Is it me? And it's me. And you only finally say, it's history. I keep on saying, I could have come earlier. I could have made a better contribution much earlier. And yet at the same time I say, I don't think I'm here by mistake. I'm here to fulfill the demands of history.
As I see the Union Jack being lowered over the smart colonial hotel and hear the sound of the last post, I know that last post will soon echo around this land, signaling the end of our domination over a once patient people.
On those rare occasions when we went to the sea on holiday, I remember always feeling humiliated when I read the hateful signs reserved for whites only. We would sometimes dare to step from our stony beach onto their nice sandy one, but always with the fear of being arrested by the police who constantly patrolled to keep us in our place.
Remember on the beach, do you remember? On this beach, you, me and Joyce sitting quietly, newly multiracial, just beginning to integrate, and this young white man came, remember him? Towering over. I thought he was coming to be friendly. And he looked down and looked at the two of you and said, welcome, welcome to the human race.
You can imagine, welcome to the human race. Wow. And indeed, when you look at it, you say, who are human? Who are? You know, you don't want to be saying, I'm better than so-and-so. But the truth of the matter is that the fact that in all ethnic black communities of South Africa, we have been brought up on one thing, Ubuntu, Ubuntu, humanity. To us, a person is more important than anything else, regardless of the color of their skin. And when you hear somebody coming to say, welcome to the human race, when indeed he is degrading you, you can only but sympathize with that type of person.
Well, he said that because those days, whites regarded us as baboons. In fact, they even called us baboons.
They said, and come from the trees.
Yes,
exactly.
And they didn't think we were human. But they didn't realize, Betty,
and Ellen, that in the process of dehumanizing us through their gruesome acts of apartheid, the detentions, the banishments, the torture, and forcing people into exile and removing people from their land. In that process, they were also dehumanizing themselves. They were trapped in their hatred and in fact imprisoned in their hatred.
You're so right, Joyce. You couldn't have given a better description of that. Indeed, imprisoned in their hatred. Looking at it now,
sorry, escape one at a time, just get to 10, maybe 3,
Griselda has an exhibition at the moment on in Leeds, Lessons in the Studio seminar, 70 Years of Fine Art at Leeds. It includes work by Labaina Hamid and Satapa Biswas. Our next speaker is Catherine Grant, Dr. Catherine Grant, and she's a senior lecturer in the Art and Visual Cultures Department at Goldsmiths, University of London, and currently working on the reenactment of feminist histories in contemporary art. And her paper today is on A Letter Sent, Waiting to be Received, Queer Correspondence, Feminism and Black British Art. Thank you.
Same desktop earlier?
Yes.
Yeah.
Found it?
Yeah.
Good. Do you want the microphone on the table?
Yeah, I might sit at the table just put the microphone a bit lower, that's okay. Otherwise I can't deal with everything, all the flickers and everything. Okay, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak today. It's a real honour to be here. There's a lot of sort of friends and colleagues who've helped me whilst writing this, and quite a few of them are here. So the people who are here, I'd like to thank Ella, Ego, who's going to be speaking at the end of this session, Althea, Hilary, Dot. It's very much part of a creative conversation between myself and them. And also I'd very much like to thank the artists, collective creativity, of whom 2 members are here, Rudy Lowe and Evan Efakoya. So I hope it's not too weird, Evan, that I'm going to be basically speaking about you. You can just, stand up and go, no, what, no. And also Labaina Hamid, thank you for your work and your writing. I never thought I'd be presenting it in front of you, so I do feel quite nervous about it. I'm giving you a paper that's from a longer article published as part of a collection edited by Victoria Horn called Danger, Women Reading, that seems quite apt for this conference. And personally, I am a writer because I am a passionate reader. Okay. In 1990, the artist and poet Maud Salter published her edited book Passion, Discourses on Black Women's Creativity. Through the press, she ran with the support of Labaina Hamid. 2.5 decades later, this book was discovered by the artist Evan Efakoya, not as part of an art school education, but through their research into the black art movement in Britain. Marking this discovery, Efakoya wrote a letter to a future younger self saying, quote, "I'm writing this to you to let you know about a book I wish I'd known about when I was studying at Winchester. This letter joins others written by artists and students of colour to express their sense of isolation, both within a mostly white art school system and within an art history that rarely foregrounds the work of British artists of colour.
To find a peer group and a historical continuum are both acts of survival, something underlined by the title of the book this letter was published in, Surviving Art School, an Artist of Colour Toolkit. Produced through the research and reflections by the artist group Collective Creativity, and the members are Reza Kabir, Rudy Lowe, Roger Rage and Evan Efakoya, the publication draws on the rich legacy of queer and feminist artists of colour in Britain, focusing on the 1980s and 90s. In this paper, I'm going to look at how artists of colour have used the published letter form as a way of connecting with and creating feminist and queer communities. I begin with Efakoya's letter and the collective project from which it arose. Then I track back to 1988 to discuss a special issue of Feminist Art News, known as FAN, edited by Himid and Salter, which is the precursor to the more well-known collection Passion, ending with Himid's recent reflections on her curation in the 1980s through a series of letters to Susan, published in the 2011 catalogue for the exhibition Thin Black Lines at Tate Britain. Reading these letters from my perspective as a white art historian, I will explore the ways in which these published letters speak to different communities of readers, particularly how the recounting of experiences and artistic practices becomes an important way of keeping artists of colour visible, both within feminist histories and the mainstream art world. I propose that the letter form encourages a reply, whether that is imagined or actual, and creates a space within a publication that is dialogic, sometimes intimate and sometimes confrontational. The three published letters explored here allow feminist, trans, non-binary and queer artists of colour to present their experiences in a manner that encourages all their readers to take part in the conversation, whilst prioritising calls for other people of colour to respond. Efakoya's letter continues by saying, quote, "I think if you had known about that then, you wouldn't have felt so lonely. You would, in a sense, because you would have still been surrounded by middle-class whiteness, but at least you would have known that artists with passion, energy and drive, who were coming from a similar place as you, existed." By publishing this letter, the future younger self is both Efakoya in the past and future students who might be in a similar position. On the opposite page to this typewritten letter is a collage, also by Efakoya. On graph paper and square paper, a list of artists is written in pen, with the first few reading Labaina Himid, Maud Salter, Ingrid Pollard. In the centre, there is a piece of lined paper on which has been typed, "There is no need to reinvent the wheel." This collage and the list of names of British artists of colour continues the work that is found in Passion, with echoes across the decades between the two projects. In Labaina Himid's essay in Passion, Mapping, she states that her writing is necessary because, quote, "in order not to reinvent the wheel, it is perhaps important to outline the chronology of the work and exhibitions of the black woman artist in the 80s, not as a list, but as a series of events and coincidences, of opportunities lost and taken, of careers made and destroyed." This is something that I think Himid realises in her letters to Susan over 20 years later. She also repeats her concern to members of Collective Creativity in an interview that was filmed at the Making History Visible archive. Himid describes one of the reasons for setting up the archive saying, quote, "I was very anxious that people of 25, 35 didn't think they had to reinvent the wheel, because it's depressing doing the same thing when you didn't need to do that." I came across the publication Surviving Art School whilst researching the collaborative work of Himid and Salter in the 1980s and early 1990s. As part of this research, I watched the video just mentioned, and there's stills from it here, which depicts the Collective Creativity members travelling here to Preston to visit Himid's archive. The film joins footage of the shelves of books, vitrines of artworks and exhibition posters, along with the artist's experience of looking through material from the archives. Efakoya has described their thinking behind the film as a way of making the archive accessible to others, discussing how archives are often difficult to access without the right institutional accreditation or ability to make the journey. The section showing the artist looking through material in the archive is a tactile montage of the ways in which archival encounters can be viscerally affecting. After watching the film and reading the publication Surviving Art School, I returned to Salter's book Passion, which also deals in great detail with an artistic community that was marginalised and demanded to be seen and heard. In the opening section, Salter, like Himid, like Efekoya, says, quote, "We must break the cycle of reinventing the wheel. Every year young women write to me asking to interview me for their dissertations." Echoing the letters, lists and collages found in the publication Surviving Art School 25 years later, there is a palpable sense of creativity and experience being left out of historical record, and the urgent need to remedy this. This sentiment also drove the group Collective Creativity, who asked, quote, "How do we change this cycle and reach out with intergenerational conversations that resituate the British narrative of black art history and its knowledges?" Their publication, Surviving Art School, provides some of the strategies, I would argue, which include letter writing, with letters to younger selves having been written in a workshop with students from Nottingham Trent University in April 2015. And I should say, anyone based in London, there are 2 copies of Passion in Goldsmiths Library, so if you're, I didn't realise how lucky I was to sort of just have those on the bookshelf, but they're there. So before I look at the other 2 published letters, I'm going to very briefly sort of think about a theorisation of published letter writing. In Gloria Anzaldúa's famous essay, Speaking in Tongues, a letter to third world women writers from 1980, she writes, quote, "It is not easy writing this letter. It began as a poem, a long poem. I tried to turn it into an essay, but the result was wooden, cold. How to begin again? How to approximate the intimacy and immediacy I want? What form? A letter, of course." This need to find a form that is adequate to the political need is something found across the use of letters in feminist publications. Her comments on the letter chime with more recent theorisations of the form in both published and private realms. Liz Stanley puts forward 3 features that are essential: that letters are dialogical, perspectival, and emergent. The second feature, the perspectival, is complicated, but speaks to why the published letter has been used in the examples I'm looking at today. She says that it is, quote, "not that they contain fixed material from one viewpoint, nor that their content is directly referential, but their structure and content changes according to the particular recipient and the passing of time." Sorry, I forgot to put that quote on the screen here. This idea of the recipient and the moment in which it is being read is something that I want to explore here through the idea that these published letters have been sent and wait to be received. In Michael Warner's influential discussion of how texts circulate and create communities, he presents an evocative account of how texts can be, quote, "picked up at different times and in different places by otherwise unrelated people." And this possibility is what he calls constituting a public. He sets out an idea of counter-publics, focusing on queer world-making, but also citing the women's liberation movement and the civil rights movement as examples, as elaborating, quote, "new worlds of culture and social relations in which gender and sexuality can be lived, including forms of intimate association, vocabularies of affect, styles of embodiment, erotic practices, and the relations of care and pedagogy." I see this ambitious list of possibilities evoked in the published letters explored here. Letters that are designed to speak to and continue to create a counter-public that brings together feminists, queers, and people of colour. Importantly, it demands the words of queer artists of colour are heard, often in conversation with one another. Whether a letter is written privately to one person or in a publication, Warner argues that a text creates a public only when it is being read. He also argues that not having access to a public, imagined as a space of discourse, leads to feelings of powerlessness and depression. These feelings are recognised in the Surviving Art School letters and texts, with the publication being one part of a counter-public for artists of colour to build upon. Their process of unarchiving, to use Raju Rage's term, echoes Warner's description of counter-publics as, quote, spaces of circulation in which it is hoped that the poesis of scene making will be transformative, not replicative merely. This description evoked for me all three of the letters I'm going to look at here, as well as the creation of feminist communities from the women's liberation movement onwards. Communities that grew from small groups that met in person to international networks fueled by publications written by and for feminists. These publications were profoundly influenced by the format of the small group and present the ways in which reading can be a dialogue or even a form of consciousness raising, both with a community of feminists in the present and with women's history. And I'll now turn to Himid and Salter's co-edited issue of Fan, a publication that comes out of this earlier moment. Himid and Salter's editor's letter introduces their special issue entitled Passion, Black Women's Creativity of the African Diaspora. Their issue editorial gives the date as autumn 1988, and they begin, Sisters. They state that they want the issue as a whole to, quote, go out into the world as a passionate letter. This passionate letter is seen as, quote, fragments reformed as notes from the underground. They address their reader directly, saying, quote, as Black women who are artists and curators, we face like you pressures of economic survival, space to life and work, and the continuing onslaught which marginalises and trivialises our experiences. This address to other women artists of colour is then continued by specifying their experience as queer women, saying, as Zamis, we try and help create a world where all women will have the right to choose and fulfil their creative potential in a beautiful and constructive, life-affirming way. Audre Lorde's book, Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, brought the term Zami into circulation after its publication in 1982. In the first chapter, she describes the island of Karakou, where her mother comes from, and the matriarchal society from which the term Zami arose. Himid's and Salter's use of the term would not necessarily be registered by everyone reading their letter, but would invoke a counter-public who would. And this has also been recently picked up by the collective that Zoe talked about, Babes, which is sometimes given as standing for Bold, Brazen Zamis. And the founder has talked about listening to Audre Lorde's book as an audio book and then being inspired by that history. So I sort of see this looping sort of resonances here. Himid and Salter's editorial, that only a few brief paragraphs, put forward a manifesto for women artists of colour, including queer women, saying, quote, we must record our own her stories, span continents, go beyond fixed beliefs imposed by the dominant hegemony. They insist on the importance of the diasporic heritage as needing attention, with the focus on, quote, a network of brave Black women who want to communicate within a context of equality. Their letter ends, diasporian blues may appear on the horizon, but our course is self-determined, as family, no maps. The editorial letter echoes through the issue, particularly with their own contributions. With Himid contributing the essay entitled Fragments that explores the artistic practice of gathering and reusing as part of Black creativity. I think that's included in the new book. And Salter's essay, which I'm showing you the first page of here, Call and Response, which engages with communities of women of colour, both within the UK and Europe. In relation to queer sexuality, she says there is, quote, a sort of a smokescreen around the issue of sexuality. I know that several of the finest, most radical artists back in London were lesbians, but I also knew that much went unspoken. Weaving together personal experiences with the political need for women of colour voices to be heard, she states, quote, across Europe in cities such as Derby, Berlin, Amsterdam, Leicester, Leeds, Black women's groups are organising, and all see cultural production as a vital element in the struggle. This desire to speak to a community of women of colour and to make their creative practices visible and connected to feminist and mainstream art worlds propels Himid and Salter's conceptualisation of this issue being a passionate letter. The issue contains images of women's artistic practice, interviews, reviews, and information about various initiatives and exhibitions. In the context of Fan, Himid and Salter were working with a collective that was primarily white women. Fan was a UK-based feminist art magazine that ran from 1980 to 1993. Many of the issues were edited by guest editors, sometimes from within the collective, sometimes by invited artists. The collective itself was very fluid, with most issues giving details of resignations and new participants, mapping a dialogic and at sometimes volatile history. Like Warner's notion of a counterpublic, the pages of Fan act as a place in which dialogue around what feminist art is and who it represents takes place with a range of voices, styles of writing and approaches to art criticism. Salter was a member of the Fan Collective for a number of years and co-edited and contributed to many other issues, and so did Himid. One of particular interest here is an issue that was co-edited by Himid, Salter, Deborah Cherry and Jane Beckett. Cherry and Beckett were members of the Fan Collective during a similar period to Salter, and this collaboration between the four women has been continued since by many decades of scholarship. And the things that Cherry and Beckett have written on both Salter and Himid have been really important in sort of researching this article. Salter and Himid's relationships with white women and the publications they were part of were not always unconflicted. In the book Passion, which followed on from this guest-edited issue of Fan, Salter bitterly recounts failed attempts at getting the book published with a number of feminist presses, and in Himid's essay, she tells how after the issue of Fan sold out, quote, a reprint was promised, further funding was assured on the strength of it, but it is now out of print. The publications in which we are colourful footnotes run and run. In a posthumous reflection on Salter, her presence and legacy, Himid comments, quote, she was always interested in preserving the archive and making sure things didn't disappear. This sentiment of preservation is one that I find throughout the issue of Fan that is seen as a passionate letter. A letter that is both being sent to the community of feminists and artists of colour that they know and speak to in the present, as well as being a time capsule to represent this community to future readers like ourselves. While this passionate letter has now widely been forgotten, the subsequent Passion, published by Salter's own Urban Fox Press, is what Effa Koya discovered decades later. What joins all these publications is a passion to leave a trace, to be visible, and to grow stronger in the knowledge of each other and the histories that underpin each one. So jumping forward to 2011, in Himid's essay Letters to Susan, A Space for Conversation was published as part of an exhibition catalogue for the Tate Britain display reviewing key exhibitions curated by Himid in the 1980s. In these letters, Himid writes in response to questions from Susan, who is presumably Susan Walsh, Himid's then partner and collaborator on the Making History's Visible Archive, as well as on the exhibition display Thin Black Lines. Himid begins her series of letters by saying, quote, Dear Susan, thank you for asking such interesting questions. The business of answering all of them is going to be a test of my resolve, my memory and my pride. With characteristic wit and attention to detail, Himid recounts the foundational exhibitions that she curated during the 1980s, which championed the work of Black British women. She describes how, this is the publication that these Letters to Susan were originally published in. I still remember, and this is a quote from Himid, I still remember and reimagine those three exhibitions in terms of artists and what they were trying to achieve, rather than a gathering or juxtaposition of aesthetically interesting objects displayed for pleasure or analysis. This continues on from her description of the artists she curated. Quote, we were not a movement or a group or a sisterhood or even close friends, but instead a fluid set of women who were not prepared to be herded into a single way of expressing ourselves. This fluid set of women are brought into these letters through quotations and many anecdotes about friendships, as well as institutional support, disinterest and conflicts. As the letters progress, Himid responds to prompts from Susan about the reasons for curating the show, issues of funding, installation, impact and future careers. At the end of her letters, Himid remarks, I cannot believe that we really have managed to bring together 7 of the artists from the 1980s shows in such a beautiful room at Tate Britain. I'm convinced that my letters to you have galvanised the goddess of exhibitions into action. She discusses the process of curating the show with Paul Goodwin, the constraints of the institution, as well as the joy of seeing the works on the walls again. And I think this is the best description of an exhibition ever, describing them as, quote, a series of magical and fantastical moments of glimpsed looks and overheard whispers as the women in the artworks meet again. This delight is contrasted with her reflection on the way in which, quote, artists' histories can still easily disappear amidst all this, and often only a few re-emerge as awareness surges and fades, seemingly for no reason. Many are still making very good work indeed. It causes pain. This awareness of the ease in which these artists can fade from history underpins her publication, which was not produced by Tate Britain, but by Himid's University Centre. These letters reprise many of the key points made in Himid's 1990 essay, Mapping from Passion. Her letters, written over 2 decades later, speak to her collaborator, presumably, a white woman artist, who might also be seen to stand in for an art world and feminist community that needs to keep these histories present. Reading Letters to Susan, I feel the generosity, humour and weariness of Himid's need to speak to this history over and over again, as well as feeling directly implicated in this history not being well known. As a white art historian whose education in late 1980s and early 1990s British art was dominated by the discourse around the so-called YBAs, the shift to centralise these vibrant histories and networks is something that is very necessary. During the 2010s, this seems to have finally been taking place with a critical mass of exhibitions, research projects and awards for artists of colour in the UK. This essay is a small contribution to returning to these histories, focusing on the overlap between queer, feminist and artists of colour communities across the UK. I've been prompted to do so by groups such as Collective Creativity, who are urging art institutions, educators, curators and writers to think about the histories that they are foregrounding. To think about the strategies to do this, I've drawn on the generosity and desire for conversation found in all these 3 published letters, as well as the anger, sadness and determination that they map in the face of ongoing racism. It is no coincidence that the word passion joins these projects. The passion to keep going, writing, making, organising, researching, a passion that is then communicated to the reader. This passion is driven, in part, by the desire to survive, both in the present and in history. The 3 published letters discussed here are examples of artists of colour creating platforms for their own practices, communities and histories, maximising the impact of the small amounts of support given by arts and feminist organisations. Using the letter form as a way to, as Ansel Dua puts it, quote, approximate the intimacy and immediacy that I want. They're directed towards slightly different audiences. Efekoya addresses a future younger self. Himid and Salter address black women and sisters, whereas Himid's Letters to Susan addresses Susan, whose name is left without further identification. With each of these letters, there are traces of communities, artistic practices and relationships ready to be understood by the reader who pays attention. As a white reader, these letters insist that I consider my privilege and to give space to these histories of artists of colour, but they are written in a generous spirit, so I can take part in their project of returning to the histories in these stories. Himid's Letters to Susan is the most explicitly, although not unambiguously, addressed to a white reader. The other 2 letters speak to other artists of colour, but are presented in a public arena in the knowledge that white feminists, queers and art historians need to hear what they have to say. The passion that is spreading through these letters, as well as the projects and communities that surround them, is fueled by the desire not to be forgotten within histories of British art and feminism. These letters have been sent, and they are waiting for us all to receive. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll crack on here. We're cracking on the right way to cracking on with Celeste. And you can't crack on better than cracking on with Celeste. I've worked closely with Celeste Marie Bernier on a number of projects. You'll probably say, not too many to count. So that's brilliant. Ruben is Professor in the University of Edinburgh, the author of over 20 published and forthcoming single and co-authored edited books. You actually kind of think, oh, you've seen everything of Celeste, and then she pulls something else out from her back pocket. That's what happened to me today. It was yet another new book. She is the co-author of the book we launched at lunchtime, Inside the Invisible. She is the Diversity and Inclusion Officer for her school in Edinburgh, and she's been cited by the Lieutenant Governor of Maryland as an internationally respected scholar, author and world-renowned historian of African American studies. Today she's going to be talking about rituals of reclaiming lost artefacts, refusing oppression and looking for ancestors in Lubaina Hamid's Heroes and Heroines. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone, it's a very warm room and you've all been sat very patiently, and he's actually a bit taller than me, so that's always new. Thank you so much. One of the most beautiful things that Mary Ann Shadd Carey said on the eve of civil war to an all-black audience in Toronto is she said, "At last my heart can rest. I stand before whole-souled friends in liberty, humanity and justice." So it is a beautiful gift to be with you all this afternoon. I am incredibly grateful to Ella and Alan and Andrea and all the team at IBAR for making the magic happen. And I would like to begin by thanking Lubaina Hamid, who made everything possible. Everything I'm about to say that's erroneous is entirely my fault, but anything that I say has any power or force is entirely due to Lubaina. As we know, in studying the millennia that is the fight for social justice, we need to use every weapon in our arsenal. As white supremacy never sleeps, as white racist privilege never sleeps, we must remain forever wakeful, forever vigilant. As Sojourner Truth said it, I live and die in the freedom struggle. And so in understanding and thinking through today, the moment we're in, as many collectives and collaborative intersectional groups that I'm a part of describe it, we live and fight in a time of courageous love, in a time of hate. And in the decades of the powerful, blistering, soul-transforming, inspirational work that it is Lubaina Hamid's vision, one of the ongoing questions is what is danger and what is safety? Those who think they are safe live in a danger that perpetuates oppression, injustice and inequality. Those who fight and understand danger take themselves to their breaking point. As Mary Ann Shadd Carey said in another speech, she said, "As I fight and campaign for social justice, I have to take myself to my point of breaking. There is no safety here." So the question of danger and safety and art and activism has defined the lexicon of liberation that is at the lifeblood of Lubaina Hamid's practice. I only have a few moments to speak and share with you today, but I want to begin to share some of those ideas and some of those concepts and understand together as we are here today in what art is, what it has been and what it will be, as Lubaina beautifully describes it, in the ongoing freedom struggle. Harriet Tubman made quilts and she sang. Nathaniel Turner was a paper maker. Augustus Washington took portraits. Carolina Le Guin was a healer. Anna Murray Douglas was a pioneer of African diasporic foodways into the New World, was a singer, and she made shoes. William Davidson and Josiah Henson were cabinet makers. Sojourner Truth was a weaver. David Walker and William Cuffey were tailors. Sarah Marinda Lo Guin was a pediatrician, an all-round doctor, and the inventor of knitting and colour therapy. Amelia Lo Guin was a mental health counsellor through the talking therapy. William still bound books. Elizabeth Keckley and Eliza Bustill were fashion designers and dressmakers. Nancy Raymond was a fancy cake maker. David Bustill made flags to Civil War black heroism that became banners of the freedom struggle. David Drake made earthenware pots. Frederick Douglass was first violinist in a string quartet. Rosetta Douglas Spragg was an embroiderer, a knitter, and a maker of rag rugs. Frederica Douglass Spragg Perry was a typist. Charles Raymond Douglas built houses, fought in combat, and held the hands of men as they died. Molly Hornblow was a baker. Robert Purvis was an art collector. Labaina Hamid is an artist, a curator, a memorialist, a historian, a political visionary, a liberator, and a thinker. In the millennia that is the ongoing fight against social injustice, the question remains how to translate struggle, suffering, sacrifice, and the word I've heard many times today, survival, into understanding what is, what can be, and what will be radicalism, resilience, and resistance. Labaina Hamid's words. One of the most powerful questions that Labaina Hamid asks across her practice is, where are the memories? Where is the evidence? And where are the heroes of black people's lives? In Success to the Africa Trade, you see behind me, the questions are asked. Not asked as questions in the same way that Nathaniel Turner told his white racist imprisoner, was not Christ crucified with no question at the end. So too is the declaration made, this is our memories, our heroines, our contributions, and our creativity. Over this millennia, over centuries, over the living, breathing minute that we're in right now, black creativity has existed. Labaina's beautiful words. Despite cramped living conditions, enforced removal, slavery, and relocation, black creativity has existed. At the heart of her practice, at the heart of the practice of many people in this room and across the world, the question is how you survive beyond enslavement, and how do you develop strategies for resistance. And those strategies for resistance, those strategies of survival, come without any safety net. They are about taking the self, the selves, the collective, the community, the collaborative world of the ancestors and descendants into a fight for social justice through finding strategies in which nothing is off limits. Images, materials, voices, memories, imaginations, and lost souls. One of Labaina Hamid's beautiful statements reads, I make visible the histories of transatlantic slaves and those lost at sea in the Middle Passage. I am not in the business of making work where I repeat the trauma. One of the most powerful questions that is our social, ethical, moral, cultural, and artistic responsibility to this day remains how to understand, how to empathize, how to create, and how to transform our understanding of what is intergenerational trauma into what is intergenerational survival. David Hammond described it as, I need to find a new fucking vocabulary to speak my truth. Gavin Janchez says, I still seek my visual language. The question of how to create, how to construct, how to imagine, how to liberate in the face of white systemic oppression that fights by every means necessary, through the pillars of classical Western art history that murders, violates, and dehumanizes, on through to political regimes that brutalize and murder. How to make visible lives lived inside the invisible. how at the same time, as Maud Salter describes it, to be both visible and invisible is dangerous to the soul. The question for artists working across the diaspora, living and dead, is the question of how to memorialise and represent slavery. Sojourner Truth used to say repeatedly to audiences, "I could stand here for hours and you would never understand the atrocity that is slavery." Harriet Tubman said, "I've lived it, that's all I'll say." Lavena Hamid says, "You could never be as ugly as the hold of a ship, or branding, or rape, or blood-stained bodies. If you're going to talk about it and change it, you have to use some other manner or means. If you're going to talk about it and change it, you have to use some other manner or means." How to understand an arsenal, a language, an activist art practice that is embedded in the lifeblood of social change, of transformation. As Donald Rodney describes it, as a way to find our own way out of the hell that is the wreckage of black art history, fighting in the eye of white supremacy. Among the different strategies that Lavena beautifully uses is the question of debating heroism in the past, heroism in the present, and heroism in the future. In Freedom and Change, as Maud Salter describes it, here, finally, at last, you see the artist free. The artist free, free at last. One of the many powerful statements that Lavena makes concerns exactly what it is in practice that can effect transformation. Everyday objects, touched and used, kept and discarded by another, can in turn, and with the intervention of the artist, be transformed into that message of resistance, resilience, and revolution. This notion of resistance, revolution, and resilience lies at the heart of the practices of African diasporic artists working across the world and fighting totalitarian, dehumanizing, white supremacist power by every new form of what David Hammons described as that new fucking language, or those new fucking languages, as he talks about it later. One of the declarations Lavena makes concerns mine utterly is political radicalism in pain. As it was in the 1960s, as it was in 1812, as it was in 1619, as it was in 1536, as it was in 1320, on through to 1120, taking it back to the beginning of time, the question is one of who are our heroes and who are our heroines. When William Still made the powerful decision at pain of his own death to decide to write the records of children, women and men on the run from the prison house of bondage in the American South and write down their stories, later he described it as an old man as saying, "I wanted to write down our heroes and our martyrs." Lavena describes it, black heroes and heroines are the struggle for our equality and our freedom. These black figures enacted the rituals of reclaiming lost artifacts, refusing oppression, and looking for ancestors. Behind me is Lavena's famous work, We Will Be, in which she memorializes the heroism of the collective in the community in general and in particular Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley, incarcerated forcibly as a child to endure the Middle Passage, who kept her imagination and her world alive despite every attempt to take everything from her, existentially, creatively, politically, and materially. She went on to become, as we know, a world-famous poet, and one of her powerful declarations was a warning to racist whites. She said, "Be warned, Ethiopians, we speak sometimes by simile." The question of understanding a liberationist art and a liberatory practice is one that is no more and no more powerfully important and necessary for us now. Lavena tells us, the aim is to establish that these captured, kidnapped people were individual human beings with personalities, with names and aspirations, hopes and tangible identities deeply embedded within their lives as abused and despised labourers. I think about people being actual people. If you were to say, off the boat today came Mohammed or David or John, and then added that before they left, they were a carpenter, a doctor, a teacher, then they would start to breathe. Living a life unpaid and abused, my figures say, you tell me your story and I'll tell you mine. Then they would start to breathe. Behind me is Levena's beautiful work of Plan B, in which she memorializes the struggle, suffering, sacrifice and survival of the unspeakable and unimaginable Middle Passage. How to begin to understand individuals in the enormity of the numbers. For individuals running from slavery across the African diasporic world, the question was always to bring us back to our humanity. How many black radical anti-slavery campaigners said, I am bought and sold by pro-racist apologists as much as I am by pro-slavery ideologues of the South. To be an anti-slavery, anti-capitalist, anti-empiricist campaigner is by no means to be an egalitarian and by no means to be an anti-racist. For people like Frederick Douglass, first violinist in that string quartet, art was salvation. By talking politics, he became a political object, as did thousands more. By talking and claiming art, he became a liberated figure. We will be made into who we are. The question in thinking through series like Plan B is this question, as Levena beautifully puts it, of how to fill gaps in history. How to understand that people survive, understand, and carry that history. Across the different series that you see, the different double paintings that Levena creates and curates in this series, we see her working with testimonies of torture, abuse and suffering across time, across history, across belief system. Runaway slaves, escaping hostages, fleeing migrants, bombed communities, and battered women. Each text was written and rewritten so that the passage would start inside the conflict, but then end with some sort of hope of revolution. What is safety and what is danger? As you see in these powerful paintings, you see the blistering power of what is an absent presence and a presence absence. If you are speaking to those in power with privilege, with a tendency to dehumanize both purposefully and unpurposefully, you have to use every means necessary. Levena Himi's practice here powerfully works with the juxtaposition of word and image, telling and untelling, showing and unshowing, concealing and revealing. In the beautiful text, she speaks to the struggles of those who make it out of prison houses, of every form of incarceration and bondage. Our entire food supply was devoured early on by a pack of stray animals. In desperation, we tried to remember which mushrooms, berries and bugs our grandmothers had once taught us were collected by their mothers years before. We were cautious and very afraid, but the forest fed us well. The glare of the sun was always intense. We suffered from exhaustion and lack of water. After many days of this, followed by the pain of freezing nights, we had to cross a deep and fast flowing river. Many of us were weeping with fear and were sure we would die, but our friends helped and comforted us. Our friends helped and comforted us. In the spirit of the power, not only of Levena's inspirational art practice, but in the spirit of her words and the life pictures she creates as much with her words as with her pictures, I started with a list of names. I started with individuals working in the freedom struggle who are famous as freedom fighters in the way history records them, through war, through memory, through activism. At the same time that they were helping bleeding, dying bodies and bleeding, dying souls, they were also artists, committed to art as liberation, as salvation, as life preservation. Many of them worked on the Underground Railroad, as evoked and memorialised in these paintings behind me, and many of them spoke too of suffering from such pain, such destruction, as to risk the loss of life, but surviving on by our friends who helped and comforted us. Sarah Marinda Loguen was a woman I started with who became the first paediatrician of colour in the United States and in the Dominican Republic, and she understood that for a mother coming out of slavery on the Underground Railroad, having lost her daughters, all she could do was sit and stare into space and fold her hands. She developed colour therapy through knitting that has become the golden standard without the world today. How healing happens in the space of life, community and sharing. Jeremiah Wesley Loguen is less known to us than the names like Frederick Douglass, and he writes a letter to Frederick Douglass that uncharacteristically Frederick Douglass publishes. We cannot all, my friend, be Douglasses, but we can do our part to liberate our bleeding fathers, our bleeding mothers, our dying sons, and our dying daughters. Among the beautiful declarations that Lubaina Hamid makes is this one. If we really believed we were the first black women to call ourselves artists, we would have an excuse to give up. And here before me is the excuse not to give up. As she beautifully summarizes, she says, we are the continuum. Never spoken of, never memorialized, disregarded, dehumanized by individuals today calling themselves radical historians is the words of one woman, Anna Murray Douglas. Why not I endure hardship that my race may be free? And as Lubaina Hamid beautifully tells us, our mothers made us strong. Thank you.
Thank you, Celeste. Now, much taller. My next speaker is Ego Zawinski. She's currently a PhD student at Chelsea College of Art and Design, working on the Jamaican sculptor and philosopher Ronald Moody. She's currently the archivist for the Rita Keegan Archive Project and a member of the Remembering Olive Collective 2.0. Her paper today is Respite and Resolve in the Archive, a Black Women Artists Retreat. There you go.
Thank you.
I'm going to stand for the beginning and then I'll be okay.
Okay,
Thank you. Okay, hi. Hi everybody. It is an honour to be with you all today. I'm going to start as I usually do, so I'm just gathering myself. With a minute's silence, I think we could do with a minute's silence today, and I'm going to dedicate this minute's silence to those that are in this room, that for whatever reasons have struggled today, and those that aren't in this room, those that we'd like to be in this room, those that have made it possible to be here. So, just get my timer. And just to take a minute. Okay. Thank you. Thanks so much. So today, respite and resolve in the archive, a Black Women's Artist Retreat, and I just want to say that I've kind of, sorry, let me sort myself out. Yeah. I just wanted to say that basically I kind of rejigged my original talk to kind of respond to sort of yesterday and the day that we had yesterday, and taking the title of Creative Conversations and Black Women Artists and kind of seeing the 2 days as a kind of conversation, whether you know it, between me and you or not. So this talk is an attempt to honour some of the moments, the many moments that mean I'm here and present with you today. The places, spaces, people and networks that I think of when I think about creative conversations and Black women artists making and doing. This is a personal reflection on my practice and life, and how a place like Making History's Visible Archive was a site of rest and restoration unexpectedly, as well as a way of bridging a gap between my life here in the UK and Minnesota in the US, and how visiting the Bainer Himid at Making History's Visible opens a space for generative, ongoing discussions, dialogue, and transatlantic possibilities. This presentation is also vulnerably a love letter to those moments. Those moments, those moments, those many moments, to the Black women artists making and doing, that have been making and doing for a long time, that have continued to make space, nurture and nourish and encourage. Putting together this presentation created an opportunity to bring together different threads in framing myself and networks in as a living archive, and therefore making myself a collection guide of moments of creative conversations of Black women artists making and doing. I'd like to thank Labaina Himid, Ingrid Pollard, and Marlene Smith for the generosity of spirit and ongoing inspiration and patience, as I often clumsily navigate my way trying to get a clear vision, whilst I attempt to find myself again, creatively speaking. To quote the words of Teju Adelaide, I am grateful for the communal ties that enable me to witness creative world making. So I'm going to take you back and forth through moments over time and then to childhood, revisiting the moments of the awakening of my own creativity, when I did just make and do. It's like a period between 1994 and 2001. My childhood home, which was essentially, when I look back, my first creative laboratory of experiencing creative conversations and Black women making and doing, whether they consider themselves artists or not. I just should also say there's going to be like, I love gifts, so I've been doing this thing with gifts, so there's going to be, flash images like this throughout. I had planned to visit the Making History's Visible Archive in July. I was going to attend the Caribbean Studies annual conference at UCLan. It seemed to make sense to squeeze everything into one journey. Fortunately, I didn't get to visit on that journey, but I did get to put a date in the diary with Lorena for August. Finally, I was going to make that pilgrimage for a place I only knew through warm anecdotes. Sage Carroll, a friend and collaborator from Minnesota, was visiting over the summer as part of a residency program based in Dundee. I thought that she would enjoy the archive, so I invited her without speaking to Lorena. This put me in a state of panic. She will think I'm presumptuous. There is a lot of inner dialogue that happens when I'm doing this. You know, like when you're in people's faces, it's cool, and then when you're outside, it's kind of, So, I desperately reached out to Marlene. Marlene said, come from a place of forgiveness, not apology. I'm not sure if that's the right quote, but I think it is. But later on, I repeated that to Sage of how she got here. And when I was in Minnesota, so I'm talking through moments and conversations. So when I was in Minnesota, we were sitting around the fire. I love fires in Sage's garden, and she repeated that. And it was a really weird moment to hear Marlene being quoted outside of this moment. But it was a beautiful moment, and that kind of ongoing journey of these discussions and movement and traces of our voices. I didn't say it at the time, but it did feel like magic. And I did want to ask if Marlene's a fan of Star Trek Discovery. Are you? Ish. But another conversation, I digress. I started off, as I would in most archives, as formally as possible, with pencils, white gloves, and thinking I knew what I was looking for, or felt I should know what I was looking for, or needed to know what I was looking for. I had a whole lot of unlearning to do. The philosophy was open access. I started off quiet, polite, trying not to make any trouble. Alfred Greenan of the Women's Art Library, I'm sure would find that hard to believe, but it was true. The experience was like a 5-rhythm dance class, starting off with a quiet tempo. I remember getting to a crescendo point by the end of our visit. A feeling that I just wanted to roll around in the material, rub myself all over the shelving, touch what was this feeling? The more we opened books, looked at materials, read letters, looked at catalogues, I thought about conversations with Evan, who often encouraged me to visit the archive and talked about their research visits in the other space before, in the house where it is now, drinking cups of tea and looking at material. Lorena has a tried and tested rhythm in regards to visiting the archive, from train times to accommodation plus food recommendations. Sage and I were content. We hooked up the record player and listened to Langston Hughes, recite poetry, Sammy Davis Jr. sing and talk live, and Angela Davis speak words that we needed to hear as we fingered our way through material. Every now and again, Lorena would check in, often bringing books, fresh new books. We bought a lot of the books that we found in the archive after our visits. We found a lot of resources. On my second visit, it was with artist Lynette Kamala, and I'd met her through her residency at the Lambeth Archive in Brixton, and she was doing a project, like a period of time of live, responsive artworks that she calls sort of freestyle calligraffiti. The exhibition was called Courage and Resilience. So I met her through Matty from 198 Gallery, and I was just dropping off some archival material for her to carry on with her project around the Olive Morris, who was an activist based in Brixton, and I was part of the Olive Morris collective that we recently reformed. And in that conversation of just sitting and meeting and handing over, I started to talk about making histories visible. Hey, this is a great place, we should do it. We literally put a date in the diary that day, and then I started plotting to come back and make another visit. Sage was also coming back in October, so we wanted to come back to the archive. like to think that this could be a thing of actually having this kind of space where we come and have these creative conversations, look at creative material, and see space for ourselves. Sage's time at the Making History is Visible was deeply impactful to her ongoing practice. Discussing her practice, she says, "I've spent the last 2 decades at the intersection of art and social practice, focused on radical healing. As you can see, my creation of Art Church and Harvest Feast, radical healing is a process of unlearning the internalized ideas that keep us from imagining new possibilities. My practice is the means to unlock these issues." Making History is Visible was a fertile space to do this work, and having seen Sage over the holiday break, I haven't got examples of her work. Well, the next slide shows a bit, but the work that she's working on at the moment, I can really see the impact of the visits that we had here on her work. She's doing a lot of virtual reality stuff with her ancestors within space, but I can see the influence of Lubaina's work within this. So, transatlantic discussions, dreaming big in small spaces, invitations. Spending time at Making Histories Visible makes you brave. Myself and Sage began dreaming. The conversations we had been having were being given context through spending time in the Making Histories Visible. For me, living in Minnesota, I have all this context for the UK, and no one ever knows what I'm talking about. So this was the first time of my conversation starting to make sense to someone. And then when I go back to Minnesota, it's really nice that somebody knows there's reference points. So that was sort of an unexpected aspect of spending time in the archive. We started to plot to make this an ongoing transatlantic conversation, and we are currently plotting to bring Ingrid Pollock over to Minnesota University, where Sage is studying March 2020 for an artist visit. Time building creative community in Minnesota has opened a world of creative conversations with Black artists, educators, organisers, community, and people of making and doing. Myself and Sage created a performance inspired by the poetry of Nikki Giovanni, stardate 18628.190. Sage had lent me her CD, and I had listened to it on loop. So the picture on the left is from our performance, stardate 200217. As part of the Patrick Cabaret's Controlled Burn series in 2017. Myself, Sage, and Keegan Scovey, who provided a beautiful poem that I'm going to recite, we'll come back in, called "Her Room Was Dark and Full of Stars." It was part installation, part movement, part sound and images, part public ritual, but a full collaboration. Also, I have that poem sort of at the head of my bed. I love it. But I'd taken it and I gifted it to Lubaina. It was a bit like a photocopy, random bit dog-eared, but I wanted to give it anyway, so that's just that happened. This slide is really about the moments of exchanges, of spending time. Somebody pulls a book out of their bag. I didn't realise how much I snapped. And actually yesterday's presentations really make me think about, these are just friends and people's books and collections, but on this side, to the furthest, is that's my collection, and really what I'm often communicating when I'm in Minnesota and realising there's a whole huge gap of art education. I can only say in Minnesota, but I just see this opportunity to share and exchange, really. So, okay. So I've got books. These are books that I've discussed with friends, networks, and people. I love artwork and book covers. Kristen's talk really highlighted that for me. we visualize. These books are Amoke Kubat's collection, an artist based in Minnesota. And when she was moving, I had the job of packing up her books. But then I was just like, oh my God, these are great. So it took ages. And she did loan me a whole load. And also in the middle, flashing up, I don't know if is Nick Brown still here? Okay, so one of those is one of your displays of Maud Salter from Innova years ago as well, kind of thing that I love. And also Belinda Kaminsky does a project called the Library of Request, where she gets black students and students of colour to provide books that they use for studying or influence their daily lives. So I love science fiction, and sometimes I feel like this is the life that I live, sort of travelling through time, in spaces, and occupying spaces is like science fiction. And I was also, I see the Making History's visible space as a bit of a TARDIS. I can call it the real TARDIS, but that's, there's something about the loss of time or just having time, and I think that's maybe what it's more about. And if I was writing fan fiction, the Bane would be the Doctor. But this is just all the influences. And I've been thinking about sort of language and literature and just maybe the role of music for me, and that ongoing kind of role of music, i.e.
My phone was going.
Okay, that's fine. And these are different moments, but I feel even me being here right now is kind of all those moments there connect to me being here right now. I have to really pull these bits apart to explain, but moving back and forth through these moments, these many moments, these moments start to not be so desperate. The conversations from these moments are appearing to take on different forms. It's truly like an alchemy. But what is this alchemy? And what I realized with the Making History's Visible archive is the role of trust. What it feels like to be trusted. And I think in this moment where we talk a lot about decolonizing archives and all that kind of conversation, I think sometimes we forget to visualize archives that have never been colonized. So in some ways, the surrealness of these moments is that my introduction was very much 2D, lots of photocopies. So spending time at the Women's Art Library, special collections with Alfia Green, and really cool. I was causing trouble. There was no doubt about it. Always sort of keep my foot in the door. But what I would say again, in regards to trust, we were able to navigate the repository and access material on our own. There was a lot of autonomy. Alfia created a lot of space for a lot of autonomy. But it was here that we, as part of an art collective, art archival research collective called X Marks the Spot, with Gina Lombard, Lauren Craig, Mystique Holloway and Zai Holloway. From 2011 to 2015, we were exploring material within the archive, but we had the opportunity to research the Women of Colour Index that was put together by artist Rita Keegan, and that opened a whole world of just black women artists. And as somebody that studied at Goldsmiths and that studied at UAL in the 90s, it was kind of a bit depressing for me to sort of discover that for the best part, I hadn't really been exposed to this as part of my education. We produced a book on the collection. We produced a publication on the collection called Human Endeavour. A creative find, because it's a long title. A creative finding aid for the Women of Colour Index, which was just gave me a snapshot of what was in the archive, and included pieces from Brian Bailey, Kate Foster, Sarita Mullings, Amanda Holliday was very generous, and included a piece, Humphrey Greener, Forster and it's downloadable. I just wanted, in regards to archives, I'm an archivist, so in regards to how we access collections and make them accessible, I'm fascinated with finding aids and collection guides and actually how often they don't really help you find anything. So people often wonder what I'm doing in Minnesota. I just wanted to share this because I moved to Minnesota in sort of at the end of 2015, the end of the Obama years. But Ingrid's photography, her pastoral interlude series, took on a completely different meaning for me while I was out there, and really made me understand myself while I was out there, and actually helped me to understand that I belong. And I've got to say, I sent these to Ingrid, so say, hey, look, I get it. Another moment was getting a chance to, and I'm talking about moments of sort of getting to this point of being introduced to these artists in different ways. So another moment was in 2017, I had the chance to research at CalArts in California, and I needed a research question. And it was one of my first sort of research visits independently that wasn't, it was for me, so I needed, what do I want to know? So I wanted to find out if I could find any traces of the Women of Colour Index at CalArts within their archive. So I spent a great week looking at stuff, I couldn't find anything, lots of interesting stuff. My background's in design, so I had a whole load of great design bits and pieces. But on the last day, I had the opportunity to speak to the audio-visual librarian, who talked about the previous librarian, and we had a conversation around slides. And it was within the slide collection that I found the Women of Colour Index, or artists from the Women of Colour Index, and it's something that I'd love to go back to. It was like finding friends in cabinets, so it was like, hey, Ingrid! What was interesting about this particular collection was the fact that the librarian Eve White had colour-coded the slides, so all the women artists are basically yellow, so when you open these drawers, it's like a visual representation, and I also find that really kind of pretty cool. So, nature, networks, and conversations. Nature, networks, and conversations. How do we, in this moment, manifest the making and doing? Since these visits, I've continued to develop a wider project alongside Zinzeli Soke, an associate professor of gender, women, and sexuality studies in University of Minnesota, and Sage, amongst others. The project is called Black Feminist Laboratories of Rest, Dream, and Co-Creation. And this is a snapshot. I just thought I'd put a snapshot of our creative conversation around Black artists making and doing. We will forge co-creative spaces for collaborative artistic engagement dedicated to rest, play, and dream, creating a practice that is produced for a place of rest. Death, breath, and re-memory. Rhizomatic connections, honouring space to heal. Dancing and flow. Moments of sweetness, encounters. Death and re-memory. Ancestral connection. Spending time in the archive. World making across diasporas and oceanic. coming together to breathe together, unlearning the reactivity of trauma and learning new responses, new diaspora, dreaming of a place where we're not supposed to be dreaming, creating our own methodologies and becoming literate about ancestral listening. We are always going, and the unnameable thing, magic. No calculation outside of the mathematics of the wake. Creating Black cultural space to grieve, creating new grieving rituals. So I kind of bring you full circle, and now I'm going to take you home to my childhood home, my mother's home, which I now realise was my first place of creativity. When I think about, this is a sewing machine, so as soon as you open the door, the sewing machine was to the left. And this is that period of my creativity of Black photography. So the next series of photographs are sort of from a period of 1994. And now I look back and think of if my art education had been different, what I'd be doing. So it's not a kind of, nothing stopping me from doing stuff in this moment, but I did lose something that I'm trying to get back, which is what places like Making Histories Visible help do. So you mentioned visual language, and I think these are my mum's drawers of her sewing machine, and I feel like this is where I began my kind of visual language, and that little corridor where she'd be sewing was like this whole world and kingdom of buttons and things, but yeah. And just the idea of the vinyl and the record and playing, this was in my mum's bedroom, so yeah. When I think of being excited to see a record player and Making History, just like, let's plug it up, or Sage has a record player in her studio, so it's just that ongoing kind of sense. So for whatever reason, my mum had mental health issues, and what I realised is that photography was a way of me managing my visits home on the weekend. But crazily, my mum would let me take photographs of her, kind of thing. Now I look back at that moment and I just think, fascinating. So I don't know, but I've been looking back. So what I'm going to do, and I've just been thinking of my mother's garden and this paper, so it's kind of a lot of these photographs I took of my mum in her garden. And I don't have access to my family home anymore, so it was a very particular moment. We also had a flood after this, so a lot of things didn't survive, so it's also a memory. So I'm going to also read Keegan's poem as I go through my last series of photos. I remember the beginning. Her room was dark and full of stars, and she whispered, "Do you love yourself enough to give birth to yourself?" In this room, hot and dark and full of stars, we have met here many times before. Born of stardust, we dance, our celestial divinity finds form and shape. Before the pyramids were complete, we swam in waters dark and deep, bodies sleek, birthed our babies under starlight. We burned deep into the bones of each other's souls. We remember when we were free. Her room was dark and full of stars, and I dreamt of other worlds and planets where we float weightless, no bodies to burden with generational pain. I dreamt of how it would feel to be free. I just got cut in because I always think my mum's doing a Run DMC kind of stuff. I awake from these dreams, and there is no sanctuary from the pain, and there is no place to return but to myself. Fall back into my own wet waters. In my fingerprints, I see swirls of galaxies and my ancestors' dreams. And hear her whisper, "Do you love yourself enough to give birth to yourself?" In this room, hot and dark and full of stars, we have met here many times before. Born of stardust, we dance. Our celestial divinity finds form and shape. Before the pyramids were complete, we swam in dark waters, dark and deep, bodies sleep, birthed like babies under starlight. We burned deep into the bones of each other's souls. We remember when we were free. Her room was dark and full of stars, and I dreamt of other worlds and planets where we float weightless, no bodies to burden with generational pain. I dreamt of how it would feel to be free. This is my sister when we were in Nigeria to go visit my grandma just before she died. I awake from these dreams, and there is no sanctuary from the pain, and there is no place to return but to myself. Fall back into my own wet waters. In my fingerprints, I see swirls of galaxies and my ancestors' dreams, and hear her whisper, do you love yourself enough to give birth to yourself? Body weighted with heartache and pain, I see galaxies in my fingerprints. I remember the beginning and dream of other worlds and planets. Look to the heavens for an escape from this place we live that we call Earth. Then I sigh and I get back to work. So my final image is just me as a child, but there's a look on my face that I don't know. So this is so I just want to explain also, this photograph I feel was the beginning of my love of photography. And this was like 1979 and my first visit to Nigeria with my family, my sister next to me and all sort of cousins. My mum is behind me and then my grandparents and my siblings are up the top. But there's always that look on my face where I wonder, who pissed me off that day? But that's it. Thank you so much.
Because time is tight, I'm going to make a start. Ella will be joining us. She said to start with actor, which is a shame because I wanted to sort of thank Lubena, thank Alan, thank Ella for organising what I think we probably all thought of as a really nourishing set of 2 days, really interesting and enlivening 2 days, but we're probably all fairly exhausted now. So I've been told to keep this snappy. So I just wanted to, when I was thinking about chairing the final panel for the day, I was trying to think across the 2 days and think about some of the sort of themes or ideas that have come up. And what I kind of came up with, in a sense, was a set of keywords, really, I thought were quite interesting and sort of seem to mark different kind of moments in terms of what everyone's been thinking about in terms of creative conversations. And those are things like, well, today, particularly in today's papers, memory, trauma, landscape, British art history, whole, collaboration and community. And I was also thinking of alternative keywords, and I was thinking about yesterday's keywords for me were things like generosity, abundance, dreaming, and this whole idea of kind of subjectivity and collaboration. And I just really wanted to sort of start off with that sense of the varieties of creative conversations that have been occurring over the 2 days and how enriching and enlivening they've been. I don't really want to take up any more time, so I want to throw it open to the audience because I'm sure you've got lots of questions for various people, and I'd like to thank all the speakers for today as well for all their contributions. Yeah, there's a question there.
So my question is for Ego. So I've been fangirling the Remembering Olive Collective for a couple of years now, and I just love how much more information has become available about her since you guys started doing the work that you're doing. And I was thinking about what Marlene was saying yesterday about a picture of a woman that's in one of her projects, and she hasn't been able to find out any information about her. So I was just wondering, where do you begin with that kind of thing? how have you like found the information about Olive that you have? How have you already beginning sort of archiving a life so long after someone's like not a part of this world?
I think there was a group. That project's interesting to me because it's also a project that resulted in some ways me becoming an archivist, because of realising, trying to put fragments of someone's history, and to be quite honest, if it wasn't for Olive's partner and her friend Liz Obi, we wouldn't really have that collection. So it was from having a basis and somebody keeping and knowing that there was value in her life, really. And we've just re-established the collection because even in that period of 10 years ago, as much as we've created sort of a narrative for her, a lot of it's also been erased just as quick. So it's an ongoing thing to sustain.
That kind of reminds me actually of what I meant to say at the end of my keywords, was that actually the thing that seems to be the thread throughout all of this is the archive, actually, and what we all do with the archive and how we're all differently placed in relation to the archive. I don't know if any of you want to say any of that, or whether anyone in the audience wants to say any more about the archive, or whether the speakers want to comment on that as a trope in terms of what we've been doing today and yesterday. Yeah.
I think the only thing I would say in relation to that is, as someone who has been trained and works on historical material primarily, what I've found is that these artists who give us the language to work with silences, because I think that, you know, as practitioners, as artists, as academics, what we're doing is working with and through silence and erasure and loss. And so trying to find that language is really difficult within academia, for example. And so artists like Lubena, like Ingrid, you know, have given us these terms. Lubena has this great term around kind of co-fabulations and speculations and animations, and I think that's for me how I've come to understand archives.
So there's another question.
Yeah, well, it's just.
Sorry, thank you. Just to perhaps follow on from that, I wondered if the panel could speak to that really evocative idea of the archive that has never been colonised. I thought that was such a potent idea, and I'd love to hear more about that.
The archive that's never been
colonised.
Who wants to start?
I mean, it's just that I was wondering, what was it about my experience at making histories visible that was so different, and that I was just like, oh my God, what, it's time to go. Oh. That I literally on the edge of tears, you know? And just realising that it came and was created from a different space, and often archives are, you know, the origin of archives didn't. So that's something that we're still grappling with today. I mean, we've just had the Vintage scandal, where a whole load of records just got destroyed, and actually a group of us done a whole series of freedom of information requests around that. There were no answers, no decent answers. Previous to that, 2012, we had the Mau Mau, you know, and the violence, you know, we talk about hostile environments. The archive is a hostile environment, and, you know, I was talking about spending time at the Women's Art Library. We created space, but, you know, if it wasn't, I'm not sure if we would have been able to do it if you weren't there and you weren't willing to, but it was always pushing. You know, I'm always in spaces where I'm kind of pushing against the grain. It took a good few hours to realise in making histories visible that I didn't have to do that, and actually the space was just for me to do whatever I wanted to create. And that was like, oh! So, yeah.
Thank you. I thought, Catherine, sorry, you want to say something?
can just do this. But, I guess for me, feminist archives have been very important in terms of creating either sort of grassroots or sort of semi-autonomous spaces for kind of creative archival practices. And for me, sort of Anne Chekhovich's An Archive of Feeling has been really important. And so for me, the artist publications that, like the Fan magazine and Surviving Art School, they become archives in their own right, and that's the nearest I can think of an archive that hasn't been colonised, because it's kind of something you can do with relatively little resources. You know, like, it doesn't require, you know, sort of hundreds and hundreds of pounds, and we can do it on a photocopied zine, or like the Human Endeavour kind of used money from the Women's Art Library, and just within the spaces of those publications, for me, it's sort of discovering the worlds and the spaces of possibility inside of them, that I guess I have a fairly expanded concept of what the archive might be like, and particularly with these histories that keep just slipping out of focus so quickly, like returning to these publications or kind of contained sort of moments of community or history seems really important, and that's kind of it's kind of where sort of our training can be kind of useful as well, you know, rather than feeling like you know, sort of in a way I've been thinking about sort of what do we need to unlearn, what skills have we got that we can still use, and like that sense of like close looking and sort of listening has kind of become really important.
Thank you. I think, the other archive, if people haven't had a chance to hear of it or see it, is the Walter and Linda Evans Archive Foundation, which is exactly what you're saying in terms of Walter Evans was a person who went through segregation, every form of challenge that the US brings, and living in Savannah, and he decided to curate and collect history. And as he said, that was Linda and I's answer to oppression, white supremacy and brutality, and he has now amassed, so he's world famous as an art collector, as I'm sure you know, of African diasporic art, but he also has 100,000 documents that range from everything and everything, such as Toussaint Louverture's letters to Napoleon, on through to Malcolm X's prison letters, on through to Angela Davis' first edition. So he has anything and everything, and they create a space. I thought what was really beautiful about what you said was that idea of being able to be in the room, you know, that idea of being able to be respected in using the material and be seen, and that is absolutely at the heart of his work.
Thank you. I thought also what was really interesting in the papers today was also about how we activate the archive as well, and I think that came through very well in your talk in particular, Ella. You know, where we could all audibly hear what was going on at that First Black Art Convention. I don't know if you want to say any more about the archive and how you work with it in your own work.
Just a little bit in terms of what there is, for where that piece of audio is. So the work of Marlene and Claudette and Keith, who started the Black Art Research Group in 2012, and there's a load of stuff online there. There's like the original program for it. The convention is on there. The audio, I think, of nearly all of the convention, which is remarkable. Claudette is by far the most interesting, but and that whole bit. But there's just loads of stuff on there, and I do come to it as, you know, as a document, the whole thing, and it's. I find that coming to things, I don't know, it might have made some people worried that people who are actually going to be, you know, who are actually there is something you're talking about in the room. But I was pleased that Marlene would be here, and that Lorraine would be here, and that people would be here who were there. I wanted that kind of combination of things, Lorraine talks about meeting my baggage meets theirs. So. So it's the Black Art Group Research Project 2012. Everybody Google it.
Yeah, and then we'll have a question. I just wanted to add two little thoughts to it, which is also this concept of the living archive, which I think you just picked up, which is that people are not historic entities, they are living archives. They actually live through certain kinds of histories, so I think that's also crucial, that it's not, I mean, that there's the people have memories, right? And that relationship between, you know, sort of intergenerational conversation, that is good because somebody else is going to interrogate somebody else's memory from the point of view of present urgencies, issues that people might need to know about or rethink or even challenge. So I don't think there's a kind of, that the archive is ever given. It's obviously, you know, we know this from, you know, Spivak and Foucault onwards. It's, the archive is created to maintain certain structures of power by making certain things memorable, giving them significance. The creation of counter-archives in the sense of that to recognition of living archives. And then, of course, the thing is we also have to read the archives. So at all times, you know, even listening to that conversation that you heard, you presented, that's not pure archive, because you know, you need to go entrance further with the living archive. Okay, so what did happen when you moved away? What did it sound like to you? What do you think this man was saying? You know, why was he saying that? You know, so one of the things I heard, which was, you know, the constant struggle between feminist readings of certain kinds of notions of why subjectivity must be articulated in art or given voice, which is one of such a sentences, as opposed to the power of a particular kind of left-wing political activism which says, you know, the struggle is the struggle and therefore there is no place for the personal. So that's already the site of an incredibly interesting historical struggle. You know, even in that tiny exchange, I was, you know, thinking about, you know, and it happens in South Africa, you know, which is, you know, in the first generation when the ANC people came back, they had been trained in Moscow and in the Eastern Europe where, you know, a certain kind of vision of what political art should be was primary. And then someone like Gavin Jan, she says, no, you know, I'll be saying, so we've got to imagine a future, and you have really deep aesthetic and political traditions, you know, challenges to each other. So I always think the combination of, you know, listening to the people who live through experience, but you have to make sure that the archive gets made, but also you have to keep reading it, because you can't spontaneously from the point of the present, you know, understand what it was that was happening in those locations. And I think that's where the kind of historians come in, and the papers I've heard today, which is where, you know, the deep historical readings and the, you know, both of you kind of elaborating since how do you make this resonate. So I think some of the key papers today is, you know, take something and you suddenly make it richer and richer and richer, precisely because you went out for archives that wouldn't be there. So art historians do not normally go out and discover geology, mining, you know, whatever. You know, they might leave us with Lauterberg, but they would never get to this, aha, and it was those wonderful links that suddenly made slightly, you know, small gestures suddenly become richer and richer and richer and more powerful. And so I thought those two papers were very much about that, as yours was, to do with, you go back to it and you thicken it, but you also recognize you're reading it from a particular place.
Thank you. I was just going to say that, and also those readings are enabled by the practice. You know, they're enabled by Ingrid's practice or Jade's practice. You know, those, and so it is that creative conversation between.
It's kind of more than enabled. I mean, I just had to write it. I mean, you know, I shouldn't have been writing that paper yet. You know, I should have waited. I couldn't wait. You know, it forced me. You know, the work forced me. Sorry.
There's questions. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, everyone. I've got a question that's sort of driven by things that I've been grappling with at the archive where I work in North London. It's called the George Padmore Institute, and it amasses about 50 odd years of radical activism in the UK and abroad, and also cultural activism. And I think I first went to the archive when I was part of an activist group. We're engaging in things that are happening in real time. And a lot of the most important work that's sort of come out of the projects that I've been involved in has been a reconnection of the collections to the communities that are being spoken about in the work. And I think one of the sort of phrases that's always running around my mind is this idea that archives is the place where history goes to die. And I really want to do all that I can, I think, to resist that urge, because I think when we look around us, whether you're involved in an activist struggle or not, you can see that there's a real issue, I guess, with a historical disconnect. So I guess I've got a question to everyone here, and I suppose this question is also haunted by the image of all the images that Ego showed, actually, of life and of the very material that gives birth to the artwork that we've maybe been talking about over the last few days. As academics, as people working in an institution, what responsibility do you feel that you have to those real constituent groups and the political struggles that we face? Because I suppose for me those archives aren't just documents or materials to read, that's a matter of people's lives, deaths and futures.
Thank you. Who wants to go? Yeah.
Beautiful question is the lifeblood of everything, and in the work that we've been doing as part of the collective in Walter Evans's archive had never really been out there. It's in his room and in his house, and there's real difficulty because getting access to it, if you haven't got the money to travel, don't know him, and so he wanted to get it out there. And so I worked with veterans, civil rights lawyers, community organisers, public educators, descendants of enslaved people, also people working in contemporary social justice movements, curators, and we did a ton of different things with the materials. So we produced a book that would have nearly bankrupted the press, that was $12, whereas it would have, if it was at cost, it would have been a lot more, that reproduced in colour everything that was there. And so for community organisers working in the Frederick Douglass House, for folks working in museums in Maryland that have no funding whatsoever, they were able to buy the book in bulk and use it in teaching situations and use it to build other archives. We did a travelling exhibition. It's a bunch of slides online. You can just download for free. They're all up there. I can give you the link. Where we've got people in Memphis, across into Georgia, across into Rochester, New York State, telling the story of the family. And the idea behind it all really was kind of trying to get away from how archives tend to lionize icons and exemplars and exceptional figures. And so the political activist dimension to it was not only getting the archive out there as a living, breathing thing for somebody, whether they're 5 years old or 92, but at the same time getting us to think about how the freedom struggle is a collective intergenerational movement happening over generations. And so what we did in the materials was Frederick Douglass was kind of the figure that Walter has collected the most about, but he also collected the archives of the children, of the family members, of individuals quilting, of combat soldiers. And so the whole different ways in which we built the materials, including curriculum pack for schools, led to different initiatives for contemporary organisers, especially on Harriet Tubman's descendants, to do work with it. So that's one of the areas we worked in.
Thank you. Sorry?
I said, how do you have the energy?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
I'm acutely aware of time. Does anyone have, yeah, there's still some burning questions. So we'll take one there and then one at the back.
Shall we take them together?
Yeah, okay. They might be different though.
My name's Susie Gallagher and I'm from Africa. And this conference has made it clear to me that me worrying about what am I, who am I an art historian, am I a frustrated artist, I'm all of those things. But in terms of the starting point, the archive, that's the photograph of the family groupings. That was my starting point. I'm in the fortunate position to have archives, plural archives, lots of archives that date back to the 19th century and perhaps a bit further to do that. And my question really is, what do you do when you have a family that has recognised the importance of archiving or collecting, and the archives sort of link back and forth from Africa to the UK, from Guyana to the UK and back, and there's this sort of flow through the generations, and it's all come from the female line. And I think that's quite significant from what you were saying about social history and championing, because it was my great-great-grandmother who started the collection basket. There's a laundry basket full of just photographs. and then her stuff was never dealt with by the sons. And about 15 years, 20 years ago, they decided they'd better sort that bit out. And so all her papers, but she was a Victorian woman, so papers and papers and papers. So I'm in this sort of unique position where I've become the guardian. So what would you do? I know how it influences me, and my influences are the activism that I've been, but also things like the textiles as well. So it's everything. So what would you each do with it, or how would you house it?
Who wants to start?
Should we just take that first question first?
Okay, and then we'll go.
We'll remember it.
I'm really sorry, but I have two questions.
Don't apologise.
And one's for Ego. It's about how she navigated the education system at the beginning of her education. I wanted to know more about that and how she felt she did it successfully. Because, yeah, I just really want to know, I guess. And I have a second question for the non-black panelists. How do you feel like your identity ever gets in the way of your ability to fully critically analyse and engage with the work of other black artists? And if you're fully able to do so in a decolonial way, or do you feel like colonialism will always create a barrier to you, like in a kind of smokescreen to you fully analysing or critically engaging with the work?
Okay, thank you. Shall we start quickly with the archive question and then move on to the very important questions at the back? Anyone want to talk about the archive?
Is it catalogued? Is it boxed? No. Yeah? Is it boxed or?
It's see, the luxury of putting your stuff.
Okay.
The fabrics are more or less boxed. The papers are not. The photographs, a lot of them have been sorted now, but there's just so much of it, and we're still collecting.
That's amazing. I would also just say to list it, and maybe what I do at this point, like the other thing about archives as repositories is that they're political in regards to space. And so I'd love to sort of say, hey, let's meet, let's talk and find an archive to deposit all. But a lot of archives don't actually have space and have a huge backlog of stuff that we don't even know, you know? So I like the idea of doing the back end work before it gets there, even if it doesn't get there. So creating, even if it's box list, just knowing what you have.
Yes, I mean, as I said, things like the photographs, yes, because I use those. I sat one night opening suitcases and just reading, and of course, my great-grandmother, telephones, people didn't have the telephones, and so it's telegrams or it's handwritten letters, so it's literally like one side of a conversation, and it's just remarkable, really.
I mean, and on a really simple, I want to sort of say, hey, there's a book there, but on a really simple level, it's like, I'd love to see it, so maybe it's just a beginning of gathering some people and sharing the material, just starting there and seeing what happens.
Just conscious of time, so shall we move to the next questions, which were, well, also to you ago, about how you navigate your education.
I was naive and I just had fun, but I didn't really know, I didn't understand the system of education. I don't know how to explain that, but there's a certain way, education systems work in a certain kind of way. And I was just interested in art, and I didn't really think too deeply about it. And it was also at a point where, you still had results. So I was at London College of Printing at the time, and I was doing bookmaking. It was just resource and play. But now I would have, I don't know. I'd just say I was naive, I had fun, but now I look back and value what I was doing in that moment a lot more. but through the work of the artists that I've discovered in recent years.
Thank you. And the final question, which is to the white panellists, how you navigate working on artists of colour in your research, I guess, within the systems of structural racism in this country.
Thank you for the question. I can't see who asked it at the back there. So I'm French-Canadian, white working class Irish in origin, and absolutely the issues of white supremacy, white privilege, white racism is absolutely at the heart of every minute of every day that I live. And carrying that understanding and burden is in everything I do, from research to talks to writing. And the heartland of it is to 24/7 have a sense of responsibility, of a sense of working to earn respect, of a sense of every minute of every day working as part of multiracial, multi-gender, multi-class, multinational, multi-positional, intersectional communities. I spend very little of my time now working in academic contexts. I work across community centres, veteran groups, descendants of enslaved people groups, working every day with an understanding of carrying the burden of having been born into that power structure and doing everything every day, of every minute of every day, to hold myself accountable to try and work for social change.
Yeah, I don't know, it's a very difficult question because when I started doing work in African-American literature in the 1980s, it was a work of reclamation in terms of British academia. No one very much was teaching it and studying it, and then it seemed to me that obviously this had to be there in the academia, and my job was to get it into academia. And then when I got a position here at UCLan, I set up a Narratives of the Black Atlantic course because I thought we should have that, and there hadn't been one before. Us and John Moore's Liverpool were the first people to have a literary Black Atlantic course in 1996, 95 even. So that all seemed very easy, and you just got on and did with it, But when you get to a different historical phase, what is my purpose? In that sense, it's no longer there's a gap. This stuff's not being done. Stuff is being done, and I a lot more than it was, and that's great. And there's a lot more work coming, and a lot more. There are more openings. There is more happening, but there is still the deep structures, and those deep structures infect all of academia and continue to infect all academia. And all you can do, and the reason I'm burbling a bit is because Celeste so eloquently said the things I do. But I'll just give you one example. At the moment, the only tour, slave site tour and tour of black presence in Lancaster is done by me. No one else is there doing it. If I didn't do it and do it as respectfully and use these figures of black agency, there would not be a tour of Black Lancaster. And when it's done by other people, by local historians, it's done disrespectfully. So if I'm not out there doing it, it's not going to be done. So so I suppose what I'm saying is, until I'm redundant, until these things are happening anyway, until some of these histories aren't being taught, then I'm there to teach them. I know that's not a very good answer, I know, but it's an answer in respect of Celeste having said most of the things I'd have said, and me just thinking maybe an example helps.
Thank you.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Catherine, because I'd like you to respond.
Yeah, sure. I guess for me, yes, it is like a smoke screen, the way you described it. It's something that I hesitate to do, and when I was writing this paper, there's quite a few times when I kind of almost didn't, and so I can only sort of say, for me, it's part of a process and sort of being part of a community of feminists, really, and some of those are white feminists like myself, and some are feminists of colour,
and it's kind of, for me, it is something I feel I'm learning about in conversation with other people, but I don't really feel secure in my position to speak. I don't feel like I have the kind of absolute interpretation, and I think that is, it's like a process of me finding out about my whiteness as well, which may not really be relevant for someone of colour reading, but that is also, that dialogue is important to me, so that's all I can really put on the table at this point.
Thank you. We really can't have any more questions, but do either or Griselda want to say anything in relation to this issue when you're thinking about your own work and what you're doing?
Really quick.
Yeah.
I don't have as much output as certainly Celeste or Alan, but I just I carry Lebena's idea of conversations with me, and I carry Hazel Carby's White Woman Listen with me, and I try and listen better, and I try and listen differently, and I just try and do the things that I do, I try and do them carefully and as best as I can in small ways that I can.
My experience is that you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So the choice is it worse to be corrected and kicked about and told that you are all the things that you are, or to have been silent and to perpetuate a system of absenting? So my view has always been that I will trust everybody to point out to me the things that I was saying I don't see, but if I don't write about artists who are from all sorts of places and raise these things, A, my world remains small, and B, I have conspired to keep something invisible. So I know that in one of the conversations I've had with Lebena, which I kind of carry as my little kind of safety net, not safety net for this moment, which is that when I make really terrible mistakes, she says, oh God, these fucking white women just don't see it. I'm going to have to do something to really get them to do it. Right? So, I mean, that's a kind of trivial thing, etc., but you just, you know, that's what I was trying to make in my paper, which is not about, oh, my whiteness, my white privilege. I mean, you know, all sorts of curious things are disguised in the way we speak and where we come from and how we look and all the rest of it. And we carry all sorts of different kinds of traumas, you know, in love, traumas in bereavement, traumas in health, you know, that we can share with each other if we start on the premise of this notion of Bantu, humanity, the person is important, to go back to Claudette. But on the other hand, it's not whiteness, it's something to do with being processed into a form of inhumanness, right? I think that's so deep, and it is our joint struggle, because we have to learn to, as it were, constitute a world in which nothing can happen to anybody that is of the level of the crimes that are the constituting ones of our present world. So that's how I kind of name it. It's not personal. I carry it, I can't stop it. And I will make the mistakes, but I trust someone will just kick me really, really, really hard and say, you've got to do it better. You've got to do some more study. You've got to think something else.
I think something that's really important to maybe say at this point is that, you know, there's a real celebration to be had of the things that you mentioned that you do. You know, those things are really important and they create space for people. And I suppose in thinking about the afterlife of slavery, that's an ongoing shock, and you have to keep responding to it and keep thinking about how it impacts people. And in the interim moment where people are making mistakes or taking up space, somebody suffers for that. And I think it's important to celebrate the good work that you do, but also in every opportunity think, what else could be done here? What's missing? How is power and history informing this moment? And I think for a conversation about black women doing art, and there's only up here, I think that's a real opportunity for the department to think about doing things differently, you know, as a positive step forward to keep these conversations going.
Thank you. I think it's a really good note on which to I don't know if it's an endless conversation. It can be an endless conversation because I don't think there's any resolution. But yes, okay, we'll give the last word to Anna and then we'll close.
It's not meant to be a last word, but it's also because Gold and I spoke about this a little bit yesterday, and I did want to say, I mean, in different contexts I might be black, but I am also South Asian, and And I understand that my experiences are very different in terms of the shared experiences of colonialism. And so I think for me, working on black artists, both African American and black British, when I was an undergraduate, where I never got to see South Asian artists or even had the opportunities to work through some of these experiences of being in colonial spaces, it was through Indigenous and black artists that I was able to, as I said earlier, see myself in these positions. So I think that's, again, it goes back to language, and these artists have given me a language to deal with experiences that I understand are not the same, but they're shared.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to draw it to a close, even though I'm sure this conversation could rumble on, but I would like to end by just thanking all of our speakers for today.
What we say right at the end here is closing remarks, and we gave 15 minutes of closing remarks. So we have 15 minutes of closing remarks. The servitors will be at our beck and call and throwing us out in the sense of that. What we were thinking of closing remarks would be to see if making history is visible, and Lorena had something to say about the archive before we walked over to it. Would that
no, I don't think I should say anything.
Yeah.
I think if you want to come to look at the print room and look at the archive, and there will only be time to just go, oh, isn't that great? I mean, there's plenty of time when we're open, but it's crazy to say anything about it when what we should be doing is going to have a look. And there are a few people here who work with me who lead us over there. Magda Stavasca and Tracy Hill will show you the print room, and Rebecca and Kristen Ayeni and I will show you the archive. But the archive space is small, isn't it? But there's a kind of holding room just before. It's a very big room that really I always want to take over and make into an art gallery, but it's a teaching room. So I think, but what I want to say is, if you haven't got time to come now, then I'm guessing what I'm going to have to do is organise a kind of 2 or 3 day thing where people come back and really look at what we do and really begin to engage with it. So if you've got time now, come. But if you haven't got time now, don't fret. Ego did a great job of giving you a glimpse. And the point about why it is like it is because it was an archive space that we made for artists. That's why you can do what you like in it. And we don't think of it as a history project. We think of it as a curatorial project. So it's about the future, even though it's holding some things of the past. So don't worry if you can't come now and you've got to get a train. I'll organise something else. Ella will help me. Okay. Thank you, all of you, for coming. It's been totally good. And thank you, Anna.